Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. Today we are going to read Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, and we are starting with chapter 4. Reading updates. I am very, very close to finishing Lessons in Chemistry by Barney Garmis. Maybe that's her name. My plan is to finish it before reading sprints so that I can move on to a different story. It's an okay book. I have heard a lot of amazing things about it, and I've also heard people not really enjoy it. I'm sort of in the middle. It's not doing a whole lot for me. The themes aren't super new, or the storytelling isn't doing something that hasn't been done before, so it's just an okay book for me. It's not one that I would blanket recommend to every single person. However, I know that there would be specific people who, if that's their reading type, yes, I would recommend it. Am I reading anything else? Left Hand of God, or no, not Left Hand of God. Left Hand of Darkness, by Ursula K. Le Guin. Still going through it. It is pretty dense, so it's taking me a little bit of time, but that is my planned read for these next reading sprints coming up. So I think that's it. I think that's all I'm reading. I mean, I'm continuing to read Dragon Ball, but that's not news. Nobody wants to hear about that. Um, so I guess that brings us to recap for today. Yeah? So we're starting with chapter 4 today, and what has happened so far. So we did get in a foreword by Olaf Stapledon, and this was written in 1937, and it's just talking in the introduction, sort of has a mirrored introduction to how Ursula K. Le Guin did, in that it's talking about how even though science fiction takes place on different planets or takes place in different time periods, like far into the future, the commentary is about things that are happening today, which is really interesting. But we do have our main character who we do not have a name for. We don't know who it is, but that's who we are. We're reading from their perspective, and we are traveling to other worlds, looking for another planet that is Earth-like. Now, it has been commented a couple times very gently and subtly to say that we are not physically going there, we are going there in our mind. So take that for however you want to read into that. And we do come across this other Earth and the other man, and we are observing, and we're observing and have been observing for a couple years now, and noting issues in environmentalism, issues with classism, issues with segregating and othering people. And it's so interesting having that perspective, like, this is the other Earth. Of course, these things aren't happening on actual Earth. So, like, the commentary is very much there. Um, yeah, and that's sort of where we are. Let me see real quick right where we left off. Um, Kendall's waking up. Give it a moment. Good morning, Kendall. Also, the last chapter was over an hour long. I remember. Very, very little dialogue. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think those are the overarching things. And of course, as we're reading, if there are things that are mentioned that I didn't talk about, of course I will pause and I will talk about them. So let me get situated here. Let me crisscross applesauce, have a little sip of tea. You do the same, get comfy, and let's start. Oof, crisscrossing. Okay, situated over here, having some tea. Let's make some more stars. Exactly. That is very hot. It is far too hot for now. Okay. This will be after we finish the chapter. You just sit there and prepare yourself for after the chapter. Okay. Chapter 4. I travel again. I must have spent several years on Other Earth, a period far longer than I intended when I first encountered one of its peasants trudging through the fields. Often I longed to be at home again. I used to wonder with painful anxiety how those dear to me were faring, and what changes I should discover if I were ever to return. It was surprising to me that in spite of my novel and crowded experiences on the other Earth, thoughts of home should continue to be so insistent. It seemed but a moment since I was sitting on the hill looking at the lights of our suburb. Yet several years had passed. The children would be altered almost beyond recognition. Their mother? How would she have fared? Bavaltu was partly responsible for my long spell on the other Earth. Bavaltu is a other man that our main character has been communicating with and sort of not translating, but getting more information than other folks have been willing to share or have been interested in sharing. He would not hear of my leaving till we had attained a real understanding of the other's world. I constantly stimulated his imagination to picture as clearly as possible the life of my own planet, and he had discovered in it much the same medley of the splendid and the ironical as I had discovered in his. In fact, he was far from agreeing with me that this world was on the whole and more grotesque. The call to impart information was not the only consideration that bound me to Bavaltu. I had come to feel a very strong friendship for him. In the early days of our partnership, there had sometimes been strains, though we were both civilized human beings who tried always to behave with courtesy and generosity. Our extreme intimacy did sometimes fatigue us. I used, for instance, to find his passion for the gustatory fine arts of his world very wearisome. That's another difference that I did not mention. So the other men on this other Earth they perceive a lot of things with taste rather than relying on like sight or smell or anything. Well, I guess they do have smell too, but instead of relying on sight, everything is described as like delicious or things like that, tasty, that sort of thing. He would sit by hour passing his sensitive fingers over the impregnated chords to seize the taste sequence that had for him such great subtlety of form and symbolism. I was at first intrigued, then aesthetically stirred. But in spite of his patient help, I was never at this early stage able to encounter fully and spontaneously into the aesthetic of taste. Sooner or later, I was fatigued or bored. Then again, I was impatient of his periodic need for sleep. Since I was disembodied, I myself felt no such need. I could, of course, disengage myself from Bavaltu and roam the world alone, but I was often exasperated by the necessity of breaking off the day's interesting experiences merely in order to afford my host's body time to recuperate. Bavaltu, for his part, at least in the early days of our partnership, was inclined to resent my power of watching his dreams. For though, while awake, he could withdraw his thoughts from my observation, asleep he was helpless. Naturally, I very soon learned to refrain from exercising this power, and he, on his side, as our intimacy developed into mutual respect, no longer cherished his privacy so strictly. In time, each of us came to feel that to taste the flavor of life in isolation from the other was to miss half its richness and subtlety. Neither could entirely trust his own judgment or his own motives unless the other were present to offer relentless, though friendly, criticism. We hit upon a plan for satisfying at once our friendship, his interest in my world, and my own longing for home. Why should we not somehow contrive to visit my planet together? I had traveled thence. Why should we not both travel thither? After a spell on my planet, we could proceed upon the larger venture again together. For this end, we had to attack two very different tasks. The technique of interstellar travel, which I had achieved only by accident and in a very haphazard manner, must now be thoroughly mastered. Also, we must somehow locate my native planetary system in the astronomical maps of the other men. This geographical, or rather cosmographical, problem proved insoluble. Do what I would, I could provide no data for the orientation. The attempt, however, led us to an amazing, and for me a terrifying discovery. I had traveled not only through space, but through time itself. In the first place, it appeared that, in the very advanced astronomy of the other men, stars as mature as the other sun, and as my own sun, were rare. Yet in terrestrial astronomy, this type of star was known to be the commonest of all throughout the galaxy. How could this be? And I made another perplexing discovery. The galaxy, as known to the other astronomers, proved to be strikingly different from my own recollection of the galaxy as known to our own astronomers. According to the other men, the great star system was much less flattened than we observe it to be. Our astronomers tell us that it is like a circular biscuit, 5 times as wide as it is thick. In their view, it was more like a bun. I myself had often been struck by the width and indefiniteness of the Milky Way in the sky of the other Earth. I had been surprised, too, that the other astronomers believed the galaxy to contain much gaseous matter, not yet condensed into stars. To our astronomers, it seemed to be almost wholly stellar. Had I then traveled unwittingly much further than I had supposed, and actually entered some other and younger galaxy? Perhaps in my period of darkness, when the rubies and amethysts and diamonds of the sky had all vanished, I had actually sped across intergalactic space. This seemed at first the only explanation, but certain facts forced us to discard it in favor of one even stranger. Comparison of the astronomy of the other men with my fragmentary recollections of our own astronomy convinced me that the whole cosmos of galaxies known to them differed from the whole cosmos of galaxies known to us. The average form of the galaxies was much more rotund and much more gaseous, in fact, much more primitive for them than for us. Moreover, in the sky of the other Earth, several galaxies were so near as to be prominent smudges of light, even for the naked eye. And astronomers had shown that many of these so-called universes were much closer to the home universe than the nearest known in our astronomy. The truth that now flashed on Bavaltu and me was indeed bewildering. Everything pointed to the fact that I had somehow traveled up the river of time and landed myself at a date in the remote past, when the great majority of the stars was still young. The startling nearness of so many galaxies in the astronomy of the other men could be explained on the theory of the expanding universe. Well, I knew that this dramatic theory was but tentative and very far from satisfactory. But at least here was one more striking bit of evidence to suggest that it must be, in some sense, true. In early epochs, the galaxies would, of course, be congested together. There would be no doubt that I had been transported to a world which had reached the human stage very long before my native planet had been plucked from the sun's womb. The full realization of my temporal remoteness from my home reminded me of a fact, or at least a probability, which, oddly enough, I had long ago forgotten. Presumably, I was dead. I now desperately craved to be home again. Home was all the while so vivid, so near. Even though its distance was to be counted in parsecs and in aeons, it was always at hand. Or eons, excuse me. Eons. Surely, if I could only wake, I should find myself there on our hilltop again. But there was no waking. Through Bavaltu's eyes, I was studying star maps and pages of outlandish script. When he looked up, I saw standing opposite us a caricature of a human being with a frog-like face that was scarcely a face at all, and with the thorax of a putter pigeon, naked save for greenish down. Red silk knickers crowned the spindle shanks that were enclosed in green silk stockings. This creature, which to the terrestrial eye was simply a monster, passed on the other earth as a young and beautiful woman. And I myself, observing her through Bavaltu's benevolent eyes, recognized her as indeed beautiful. To a mind habituated to the other earth, her features and her every gesture spoke of intelligence and wit. Clearly, if I could admire such a woman, I myself must have changed. It would be tedious to tell of the experiments by which we acquired and perfected the art of controlled flight through interstellar space. Suffice it that, after many adventures, we learned to soar up from the planet whenever we wished, and to direct our course by mere acts of volition, hither and thither among the stars. We seemed to have much greater facility and accuracy when we worked together than when either ventured into space by himself. Our community of mind seemed to strengthen us even for spatial locomotion. It was a very strange experience to find oneself in the depth of space, surrounded only by darkness and stars, yet to be all the while in the close personal contact with an unseen companion. As the dazzling lamps of heaven flashed past us, we would think to one another about our experiences, or debate our plans, or share our memories of our native worlds. Sometimes we used my language, sometimes his. Sometimes we needed no words at all, but merely shared the flow of imagery in our two minds. The sport of disembodied flight among the stars must surely be the most exhilarating of all athletic exercises. It was not without danger, but its danger, as we soon discovered, was psychological, not physical. In our bodiless state, collision with celestial objects mattered little. Sometimes, in the early stages of our adventure, we plunged by accident headlong into a star. Its interior would, of course, be inconceivably hot, but we experienced merely brilliance. The psychological dangers of the sport were grave. We soon discovered that disheartenment, mental fatigue, fear, all tended to reduce our powers of movement. More than once we found ourselves immobile in space, like a derelict ship on the ocean, and such was the fear roused by this plight that there was no possibility of moving till, having experienced the whole gamut of despair, we passed through indifference and on into philosophic calm. A still graver danger, but one which trapped us only once, was mental conflict. A serious discord of purpose over our future plans reduced us not only to immobility, but to terrifying mental disorder. Hallucinations tricked us. The power of coherent thought vanished. After a spell of delirium filled with an overwhelming sense of impending annihilation, we found ourselves back on the other Earth. Bavaltu in his own body, lying in bed as he had left it. I, once more a disembodied viewpoint floating somewhere over the planet's surface. Both were in a state of insane terror, from which we took long to recover. Months passed before we renewed our partnership and our adventure. Long afterwards, we learned the explanation of this painful incident. Seemingly, we had attained such a deep mental accord that, when conflict arose, it was more like dissociation within a single mind than discord between two separate individuals. Hence its serious consequences. As our skill in disembodied flight increased, we found intense pleasure in sweeping hither and thither among the stars. We tasted the delights at once of skating and of flight. Time after time, for sheer joy, we traced huge figures of 8 in and out around the two partners of a double star. Sometimes we stayed motionless for long periods to watch at close quarters the waxing and waning of a variable. Often we plunged into a congested cluster and slid amongst its suns like a car gliding among the lights of a city. Often we skimmed over billowy and palely luminous surfaces of gas, or among feathery shreds of prominence, or plunged into mist to find ourselves in a world of featureless dawn light. Sometimes, without warning, dark continents of dust engulfed us, blotting out the universe. Once, as we were traversing a populous region of the heaven, a star suddenly blazed into exaggerated splendor, becoming a nova. As it was apparently surrounded by a cloud of non-luminous gas, we actually saw the expanding sphere of light which was radiated by the star's explosion. Traveling outward at light's speed, it was visible by reflection of the surrounding gas, so that it appeared like a swelling balloon of light, fading as it spread. These were but a few of the stellar spectacles that delighted us while we easefully skated, as on swallow wings, hither and thither among the neighbors of the other sun. This was during our period of apprenticeship to the craft of interstellar flight. When we had become proficient, we passed further afield and learned to travel so fast that, as on my own earlier and involuntary flight, the forward and hinder stars took color, and presently all was dark. Not only so, but we reached to that more spiritual vision also experienced on my earlier voyage, in which these vagaries of physical light are overcome. On one occasion, our flight took us outwards towards the limit of the galaxy and into the emptiness beyond. For some time, the near stars had become fewer and fewer. The hinder hemisphere of sky was now crowded with faint lights, while in front of us lay starless blackness, unrevealed, unrelieved, save by a few isolated patches of scintillation, a few detached fragments of the galaxy or planetary sub-galaxies. Apart from these, the dark was featureless, save for half a dozen of the vague flecks which we knew to be the nearest of the alien galaxies. Awed by this spectacle, we stayed long motionless in the void. It was indeed a stirring experience to see spread out before us a whole universe, containing a billion stars and perhaps thousands of uninhabited worlds, and to know that each tiny fleck in the black sky was itself another such universe, and that millions more were among them, that millions more of them were invisible only because of their extreme remoteness. What was the significance of this physical immensity and complexity? By itself, plainly, it constituted nothing but sheer futility and desolation. But with awe and hope, we told ourselves that it promised an even greater complexity and subtlety and diversity of the physical. Oh, not of the physical, of the psychical. Excuse me. This alone could justify it. But this formidable promise, though inspiring, was also terrifying. Like a nestling that peers over the nest's rims for the first time and then shrinks back from the great world into its tiny home, we had emerged beyond the confines of that little nest of stars which for so long, but falsely, men called the universe. And now we sank back to bury ourselves once more in the genial precincts of our native galaxy. As our experiences had raised many theoretical problems which we could not solve without further study of astronomy, we now decided to return to the other Earth. But after long and fruitless search, we realized that we had completely lost our bearings. The stars were all much alike, save that few in this early epoch were as old and temperate as the old sun, or as the other sun, not the old one, excuse me. Searching at random, but at high speed, we found neither Bovaltu's planet nor mine, nor any other solar system. Frustrated, we came to rest once more in the void to consider our plight. On every side, the ebony of the sky, patterned with diamonds, confronted us with an enigma. Which spark of all this stardust was the other sun? As was usual in the sky of this early epoch, streaks of nebular matter were visible in all directions, but their shapes were unfamiliar and useless for orientation. The fact that we were lost among the stars did not distress us. We were exhilarated by our adventure, and each was a cause of good spirits in the other. Our recent experiences had quickened our mental life, still further organizing our two minds together. Two disembodied minds occupying the same visual position, possessing the same memories and desires, and often performing the same mental acts at the same time, can scarcely be conceived as distinct beings. Yet, strangely enough, this growing identity was complicated by an increasingly intense mutual realization and comradeship. Our penetration of one another's minds brought to each not merely addition, but multiplication of mental riches. For each knew inwardly not only himself and the other, but also the contrapunctal harmony of each in relation to the other. Indeed, in some sense, which I cannot precisely describe, our union of minds brought into being a third mind, as yet intermittent, but more subtly conscious than either of us in the normal state. Each of us, or rather both of us together, woke up, now and then, to be this superior spirit. All the experiences of each took on a new significance in the light of the other, and our two minds together became a new, more penetrating and more self-conscious mind. In this state of heightened lucidity, we, or rather the new I, began deliberately to explore the psychological possibilities of other types of beings and intelligent worlds. With new penetration, I distinguished in myself and in Bovaltu those attributes which were essential to the spirit and those mere accidents imposed on each by his peculiar world. This imaginative venture was soon to prove itself a method, and a very potent method, of cosmological research, we now began to realize more clearly a fact that we had long suspected. In my previous interstellar voyage, which brought me to the other Earth, I had unwittingly employed two distinct methods of travel: the method of disembodied flight through space, and a method which I shall call psychical attraction. This consisted of telepathic projection of the mind directly into some alien world, remote perhaps in time and space, but mentally in tune with the explorer's own mind at the time of the venture. Evidently, it was this method that had really played the chief part in directing me to the other Earth. The remarkable similarities of our two races had set up a strong psychical attraction, which had been far more potent than all my random interstellar wanderings. It was this method that Bavaltu and I were now to practice and perfect. Presently we noticed that we were no longer at rest, but slowly drifting. We had also a strange sense that, though we were seemingly isolated in a vast desert of stars and nebulae, we were, in fact, in some kind of mental proximity with unseen intelligences. Concentrating on this sense of presence, we found that our drift accelerated, and that, if we tried by a violent act of volition to change its course, we inevitably swung back into the original direction as soon as our effort ceased. Soon our drift became a headlong flight. Once more the forward stars turned violet, the hinder red. Once more all vanished. In absolute darkness and silence, we debated our situation. Clearly, we were now passing through space more quickly than light itself. Perhaps we were also, in some incomprehensible manner, traversing time. Meanwhile, that sense of the proximity of other beings became more and more insistent, though no less confused. Then once again the stars appeared, though they streamed past us like flying sparks. They were colorless and normal. One brilliant light lay right ahead of us. It waxed, became a dazzling splendor, then visibly a disk. With an effort of will we decreased our speed, and cautiously we swung round this sun, searching. To our delight, it proved to be attended by several of the grains that may harbor life. Guided by our unmistakable sense of mental presence, we selected one of these planets and slowly descended toward it. End of chapter 4. All right, so we, as the main character, again, we do not have a name, no name. We are now traveling with Bavaltu, trying to get back to our Earth, but having a grand time just flying among the stars, and have found this other planet, not Earth, but an other Earth maybe. There are beings there, so we will see what this planet is like. Also, we have found out that not only have we traveled through space, but we've also traveled through time. So who knows what things are going to be like when we get back to Earth, our Earth. Ooh, this next chapter is really long. It's over an hour. I will be taking breaks. Oh, and it looks like this chapter is also divided into different parts too, so that's helpful. Helpful for breaks anyway. Chapter 5. Worlds Innumerable. Part 1. The Diversity of Worlds. The planet on which we now descended after our long flight among the stars was the first of many to be visited. In some we stayed, according to the local calendar, only a few weeks, in others, several years, housed together in the mind of some native. Often when the time came for our departure, our host would accompany us for subsequent adventures. As we passed from world to world, as experience was piled among experience like geological strata, it seemed that this strange tour of worlds was lasting for many lifetimes. Yet, thoughts of our own home planets were constantly with us. Indeed, in my case, it was not till I found myself thus exiled that I came to realize fully the little jewel of personal union that I had left behind. I had to comprehend each world as best I could by reference to the remote world where my own life had happened, and above all by the touchstone of that common life that she and I had made together. Before trying to describe, or rather suggest, the immense diversity of worlds which I entered, I must say a few words about the movement of the adventure itself. After the experiences which I have just recorded, it was clear that the method of disembodied flight was of little use. It did indeed afford us extremely vivid perception of the visible features of our galaxy, and we often used it to orient ourselves when we had made some fresh discovery by the method of psychological attraction. But since it gave us freedom only of space and not of time, and since, moreover, planetary systems were so very rare, the method of sheer random physical flight alone was almost infinitely unlikely to produce results. Psychical attraction, however, once we had mastered it, proved very effective. This method depended on the imaginative reach of our own minds. At first, when our imaginative power was strictly limited by experience of our own worlds, we could make contact only with worlds closely akin to our own. Moreover, in this novitiate stage of our work, we invariably came upon these worlds when they were passing through the same spiritual crisis as that which underlies the plight of Homo sapiens today. It appeared that, for us to enter any world at all, there had to be a deep-lying likeness or identity in ourselves and our hosts. As we passed on from world to world, we greatly increased our understanding of the principles underlying our venture and our powers of applying them. Further, in each world that we visited, we sought out a new collaborator to give us insight into his world and to extend our imaginative reach for further exploration of the galaxy. This snowball method by which our company was increased was of great importance, since it magnified our powers. In the final stages of the exploration, we made discoveries which might well be regarded as infinitely beyond the range of any single and unaided human mind. At the outset, Bavaltu and I assumed that we were embarking on a purely private adventure, and later, as we gathered helpers, we still believed that we ourselves were the sole initiators of cosmical exploration. But after a while, we came in psychical contact with another group of cosmical explorers, natives of worlds as yet unknown to us, each with unknown to us. With these adventures, after difficulties and often distressing experiments, we joined forces, entering first into intimate community, and later into that strange mental union which Bavaltu and I had already experienced together in some degree on our first voyage among the stars. When we had encountered many more such groups, we realized that, though each little expedition had made a lonely start, all were destined sooner or later to come together. For, no matter how alien from one another at that outset, each group gradually acquired such far-reaching imaginative power that sooner or later it was sure to make contact with others. In time, it became clear that we, individual inhabitants of a host of worlds, were playing a small part in one of the great movements by which the cosmos was seeking to know itself and even see beyond itself. In saying this, I do not for a moment claim that, because I have shared in this vast process of cosmical self-discovery, the story which I have to tell is true in a fully literal sense. Plainly, it does not deserve to be taken as part of the absolute objective truth about the cosmos. I, the human individual, can only in a more superficial and falsifying way participate in the superhuman experience of that communal I, which was supported by the innumerable explorers. This book must needs be a ludicrously false caricature of our actual adventure. But further, though we were and are a multitude drawn from a multitude of spheres, we represent only a tiny fraction of the diversity of the whole cosmos. Thus, even the supreme moment of our experience, when it seemed to us that we had penetrated to the very heart of reality, must in fact have given us no more than a few shreds of truth, and these not literal, but symbolic. My account of that part of my adventure which brought me into contact with worlds of more or less human type may be fairly accurate, but that which deals with more alien spheres must be far from the truth. The other Earth I have probably described with little more falsehood than our historians commit to telling in the past ages of Homo sapiens. But of the less human worlds and the many fantastic kinds of beings which we encountered up and down the galaxy and throughout the whole cosmos and even beyond it, I shall perforce make statements which, literally regarded, must be almost wholly false. I can only hope that they have the kind of truth that we sometimes find in myths. Yes, more sci-fi reading today. Yes, yes, yes. Cozy sci-fi vibes. That's all we're doing today. Since we were now free of space, we ranged with equal ease over the nearer and the remoter tracts of this galaxy, that we did not till much later make contact with minds in other galaxies was not due to any limitation imposed by space, but seemingly to our own inveterate parochialism, to a strange limitation of our own interest, which for long rendered us inhospitable to the influence of worlds lying beyond the confines of the Milky Way. I shall say more of this curious restriction when I come to describe how we did at last outgrow it. Along with freedom of space, we had freedom of time. Some of the worlds that we explored in this early phase of our adventure ceased to exist long before my native planet was formed. Others were its contemporaries. Others were not born till the old age of our galaxy, when the Earth had been destroyed, and a large number of the stars had already been extinguished. As we searched up and down time and space, discovering more and more of the rare grains called planets, as we watched race after race struggle to a certain degree of lucid consciousness, only to succumb to some external accident or, more often, to some flaw in its own nature, we were increasingly oppressed by a sense of futility. The plain the planlessness of the cosmos. A few worlds did indeed wake to such lucidity that as they passed beyond our ken, but several of the most brilliant of these occurred in the earliest epoch of the galactic story, and nothing that we could as yet discover in the later phases of the cosmos suggested that any galaxies, still less the cosmos as a whole, had at last come, or will at last come, more under the sway of the awakened spirit than they were during the epoch of those early brilliant worlds. Not till a much later stage of our inquiry were we fitted to discover the glorious but ironical and heart-rending climax for which this vast proliferation of worlds was but a prologue. In the first phase of our adventure, when, as I have said, our powers of telepathic exploration were incomplete, every world that we encountered turned out to be in the throes of the same spiritual crisis as that which we knew so well on our native planets. This crisis I came to regard as having two aspects. It was at once a moment in the spirit's struggle to become capable of true community on a worldwide scale, and it was a stage in the age-long task of achieving the right, the finally appropriate, the spiritual attitude toward the universe. In every one of these chrysalis worlds, thousands of millions of persons were flashing into existence, one after the other, to drift gropingly about for a few instants of cosmical time before they were extinguished. Most were capable, at least in some humble degree, of the intimate kind of community which is personal affection. But for nearly all of them, a stranger was ever a thing to fear and hate, and even their intimate loving was inconstant and lacking in insight. Nearly always they were intent merely on seeking for themselves respite from fatigue or boredom, fear or hunger. Like my own race, they never fully awoke from the primeval sleep of the sub-man. Only a few here and there, now and then, were solaced, goaded, or tortured by moments of true wakefulness. Still fewer attained a clear and constant vision, even of some partial aspect of truth, and their half-truths they nearly always took to be absolute. Propagating their little partial truths, they bewildered and misdirected their fellow mortals as much as they helped him. That totally doesn't happen on regular Earth. There's no way that there's any propagating of little partial truths. There's no bewildering or misdirecting fellow mortals on real Earth. That's only on other Earth. Each individual spirit in nearly all these worlds attained at some point in life some lowly climax of awareness and of spiritual integrity, only to sink slowly or catastrophically back into nothingness. Or so it seemed. As in my own world, so in all these others, lives were spent in pursuit of shadowy ends that remained ever just around the corner. There were vast tracts of boredom and frustration, with here and there some rare, bright joy. There were ecstasies of personal triumph, of mutual intercourse and love, of intellectual insight, of aesthetic creation. There were also religious ecstasies, but these, like all else in these worlds, were obscured by false interpretations. There were crazy ecstasies of hate and cruelty, felt against individuals and against groups. Sometimes during this Earth phase of our adventure, we were so distressed by the incredible bulk of suffering and of cruelty up and down the worlds that our courage failed, our telepathic powers were disordered, and we slipped toward madness. It's Other Earth. We just call it Other Earth. It's not our Earth, it's Other Earth. Other Earth gave you that. Yet most of these worlds were really no worse than our own. Like us, they had reached the stage when the spirit, half awakened from brutishness and very far from maturity, can suffer most desperately and behave most cruelly. And like us, these tragic but vital worlds, visited in our early adventures, were agonized by the inability of their minds to keep pace with changing circumstance. They were always behindhand, always applying old concepts and old ideals inappropriate to novel situations. Like us, they were constantly tortured by their hunger for a degree of community which their condition demanded, but their poor, cowardly, selfish spirits could by no means attain. Only in couples and in little circles of companions could they support true community, the communion of mutual insight and respect and love. But in their tribes and nations they conceived all too easily the sham community of the pack, baying in unison of fear and hate. Particularly in one respect, these races were recognizably our kin. Each had risen by a strange mixture of violence and gentleness. The apostles of violence and the apostles of gentleness swayed them this way and that. At the time of our visit, many of these worlds were in the throes of a crisis of this conflict. In the recent past, loud lip service had been paid to gentleness and tolerance and freedom, but the policy had failed, because there was no sincere purpose in it, no conviction of the spirit, no true experience of respect for individual personality. All kinds of self-seeking and vindictiveness had flourished, secretly at first, then openly as shameless individualism. Then, at last, in rage, the peoples turned away from individualism and plunged into the cult of the herd. At the same time, in disgust with the failure of gentleness, they began openly to praise violence and the ruthlessness of the God-sent hero and of the armed tribe. Those who thought they believed in gentleness built up armament for their tribes against those foreign tribes whom they accused of believing in violence. The highly developed technique of violence threatened to destroy civilization. Year by year, gentleness lost ground. Few could understand that their world must be saved, not by violence in the short run, but by gentleness in the long run. And still fewer could see that, to be effective, gentleness must be a religion, and that lasting peace can never come till the many have wakened to the lucidity of consciousness which, in all these worlds, only the few could as yet attain. If I were to describe in detail every world that we explored, this book would develop into a world of libraries. I can give only a few pages to the many types of worlds encountered in this early stage of our adventure, up and down the whole breadth and length of the whole duration of our galaxy. Some of these types had apparently very few instances. Others occurred in scores or hundreds. The most numerous of all classes of intelligent worlds is that which includes the planet familiar to readers of this book. Homo sapiens has recently flattered and frightened himself by conceiving that, though perhaps he is not the sole intelligence of the cosmos, he is at least unique, and that worlds suited to intelligent life of any kind must be extremely rare. This view proves ludicrously false. In comparison with the unimaginable number of the stars, intelligent worlds are, indeed, very rare. But we discovered some thousands of worlds much like the Earth and possessed by beings of essentially humankind, though superficially they were often unlike the types that we call human. The other men were amongst the most obviously human, but in a later stage of our adventure, when our research was no longer restricted to worlds that had reached the familiar spiritual crisis, we stumbled on a few planets inhabited by races almost identical with Homo sapiens, or rather, with a creature that Homo sapiens was in the earliest phases of his existence. These most human worlds we had not encountered earlier because, by one accident or another, they were destroyed before reaching the stage of our own mentality. Long after we had succeeded in extending our research from our peers among the worlds to our inferiors in mental rank, we remained unable to make any sort of contact with beings who had passed wholly beyond the attainment of Homo sapiens. Consequently, though we traced the history of many worlds through many epochs and saw many reach a catastrophic end or sink into stagnation and inevitable decline, there were a few with which, do what we would, we lost touch just at that moment when they seemed ripe for a leap forward into some more developed mentality. Not till a much later stage of our adventure, when our corporate being had itself been enriched by the influx of many superior spirits, were we able to pick up once more the threads of these most exalted world biographies. And I'm going to take a tea break because that's the end of part 1 in chapter 5. Who knows how many parts there are? Not I. So, in this first part of chapter 5, of course, we're getting commentary, and we're getting commentary on, well, we've already mentioned the half-truths misguiding folks around, and there's also commentary on religion as well, and that, yes, you can rule or have a religion that perpetrates hate and violence, and sure, that totally works in the short run. But in order to sustain, it needs to be led by love, and I think forgiveness was mentioned as well, and acceptance and that sort of thing. So, also commentary on religion, which is interesting. I'm finding it different. I would say difficult, but different to give these sort of recaps than other books that are more heavily plot, because it is so heavy into commentary and it is so, I guess, philosophical as well, and such a mental journey rather than like this person did this in this chapter and this was the reaction that they were having, like that sort of thing. So it's just interesting. It's a new challenge for me to be able to put into words the like a short summary, to condense what has happened into a couple sentence when it's not plot, heavy action. Oh my gosh. Thank you for that. I guess when I tapped my microphone, oh no. Okay, we're gonna start the second part over. Thank you for telling me. Goodness me. Goodness me. Oh my gosh. I like knocked into my microphone, I guess. Okay, cool. We'll start part 2, chapter 5 again. Um, Thank you. Thank you for that, for realizing that I'm talking and nothing is coming out. Uh, oh, you thought it was on your end. Nope, it's me. User error. It's just me being a dope. Cool, 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 cool. Well, I did say that I'm glad that you also enjoyed the brief summaries and the synthesis of after each portion. It helps me to sort of make sense of what has happened as well. And then yeah, like reading out loud and being able to synthesize at the end of what was actually being read is a skill that is something that I've had to develop. Does not come naturally. Uh, yeah, because and listening is so different just in like information intake than reading or than listening and reading at the same time. So yeah. Yeah. It's very easy to get lost in when somebody is reading or when you're listening to like an audiobook or something like that. I lost connection with Earth. Yeah, I'm on Other Earth right now. Way worse for your ears. Yes, yes. I find that I do get sometimes it's just so much easier to get distracted. Just so much easier to get distracted if you're solely listening to something. Hmm. For sure, for sure. Okay, I'm gonna take another sip of tea and then I'm not gonna mute myself this time and then we'll start. Such a dope. Cool. All right, part two of chapter five, Strange Mankinds. Though all the worlds which we entered in the first phase of our adventure were in the throes of the crisis known so well in our own world, some were occupied by races biologically similar to man, others by very different types. The more obviously human races inhabited planets of much the same size and nature as the Earth and the other Earth. Okay, this is when we realized that I was muted, so we didn't get too far, which is great. All, whatever the vagaries of their biological history, had finally been molded by circumstance to the erect form which is evidently most suited to such worlds. Nearly always the two nether limbs were used for locomotion, the two upper limbs for manipulation. Generally, there were some sort of head containing the brain and the organs of remote perception, and perhaps the orifices for eating and breathing. In size, these quasi-human types were seldom larger than our largest gorillas, seldom much smaller than monkeys, but we could not estimate their size with any accuracy, as we had no familiar standards of measurements. Life is too long, says the Highlander fan. I totally know. Yes. Within this approximately human class, there was great variety. We came upon feathered, penguin-like men, descended from true flyers, and on some small planets we found birdmen who retained the power of flight, yet were able to carry an adequate human brain. Even on some larger planets, with exceptionally buoyant atmosphere, men flew with their own wings. Then there were men that had developed from a slug-like ancestor along a line which was not vertebrate, still less mammalian. Men of this type attained the necessary rigidity and flexibility of limb by means of a delicate internal basket-work of wiry bones. On one very small but Earth-like planet, we discovered a quasi-human race which was probably unique. Here, though life had evolved much as on Earth, all the higher animals differed remarkably from the familiar type in one obvious respect. They were without that far-reaching duplication of organs which characterizes all our vertebrates. Thus, a man in this world was rather like half a terrestrial man. He hopped on one sturdy, splay-footed leg, balancing himself with a kangaroo tail. A single arm protruded from his chest, but branched into 3 forearms and prehensile fingers. Above his mouth was a single nostril, above that an ear, and on the top of his head a flexible 3-pronged proboscis bearing 3 eyes. A very different and fairly common quasi-human kind was sometimes produced by planets rather larger than Earth. Owing to the greater strength of gravitation, there would first appear, in place of the familiar quadruped, a 6-legged type. This would proliferate into little sextuped burrowers, swift and elegant sextuped grazers, a sextuped mammoth, complete with tusks, and many kinds of sextuped carnivora, excuse me. Men, I'm just like too scared about all of these 6-legged creatures where they're all 6 legs. I don't like that. It's creepy. Man in these worlds sprang usually from small opossum-like creatures, which had come to use the first in its 3 pairs of limbs for nest building or for climbing. In time, the forepart of its body thus became erect, and it gradually assumed a form not unlike that of a quadruped, with a human torso in place of a neck. In fact, it became a centaur, with 4 legs and 2 capable arms. It was very strange to find oneself in a world in which all the amenities and conveniences of civilization were fashioned to suit men in this form. In one of these worlds, rather smaller than the rest, man was not a centaur, though centaurs were among his remote ancestors. In subhuman stages of evolution, the pressure of the environment had telescoped the horizontal part of the centaur's body, so that the forelegs and the hind legs were drawn closer and closer together, till at last they became a single, sturdy pair. Thus man and his nearer ancestors were bipeds with very large rumps, reminiscent of the Victorian bustle, and legs whose internal structure still showed their centaur origin. One very common kind of quasi-human world I must describe in more detail, as it plays an important part in the history of our galaxy. In these worlds, man, though varying greatly in form and fortune in particular worlds, had in every case developed from a sort of 5-pronged marine animal, rather like a starfish. This creature would in time specialize 1 prong for perceiving, 4 for locomotion. Later it would develop lungs, a complex digestive apparatus, and a well-integrated nervous system. Later still, the perceiving limb would produce a brain, the others becoming adapted for running and climbing. The soft spines which covered the body of the ancestral starfish often developed into a kind of spiky fur. In due season, there would arise an erect, intelligent biped, equipped with eyes, nostrils, ears, taste organs, and sometimes organs of electric perception. Save for the grotesqueness of their faces and the fact that the mouth was generally upon the belly, these creatures were remarkably human. Their bodies, however, were usually covered with the soft spines or fat hairs characteristic of these worlds. Clothes were unknown, save as protection against cold in the Arctic regions. Their faces, of course, were apt to be far from human. The tall head often bore a coronet of 5 eyes. Large single nostrils, used for breathing and smelling and also speaking, formed another circlet below the eyes. The appearance of these human echinoderms belied their nature, for though their faces were inhuman, the basic patterns of their minds was not unlike our own. Their senses were much like ours, save that in some worlds they developed a far more varied color sensitivity. Those races that had the electric sense gave us some difficulty, for in order to understand their thought, we had to learn a whole new gamut of sense qualities and a vast system of unfamiliar symbolism. The electric organs detected very slight differences of electric charge in relation to the subject's own body. Originally, this sense had been used for revealing enemies equipped with electric organs of offense, but in man its significance was chiefly social. It gave information about the emotional state of one's neighbors. Beyond this, its function was meteorological. One example of this kind of world, one which clearly illustrates the type and at the same time presents interesting peculiarities, must be described in more detail. The key to the understanding of the race is, I believe, its strange method of reproduction, which was essentially communal. Every individual was capable of budding a new individual, but only at certain seasons, and only after stimulation by a kind of pollen emanating from the whole tribe and carried on the air. The grains of this ultra-microscopically fine pollen dust were not germ cells, but genes, the elementary factors of inheritance. The precincts of the tribe were at all times faintly perfumed by the communal pollen, but on occasions of violent group emotions, the pollen cloud became so intensified as to be actually visible as a haze. Only on these rare occasions was conception probable. Breathed out by every individual, the pollen was breathed in by those who were ripe for fertilization. By all, it was experienced as a rich and subtle perfume, to which each individual contributed its peculiar odor. By means of a curious psychical and physiological mechanism, the individual in heat was moved to crave stimulation by the full perfume of the tribe, or of the great majority of its members, and indeed, if the pollen clouds were insufficiently complex, conception would not occur. Cross-fertilization between tribes happened in intertribal warfare and in the ceaseless coming and going between tribes in the modern world. In this race, then, every individual might bear children. Every child, though it had an individual as its mother, was fathered by the tribe as a whole. Expectant parents were sacred and were tended communally. When the baby echinoderm finally detached itself from the parental body, it also was tended communally, along with the rest of the tribe's juvenile population. In civilized societies, it was handed over to professional nurses and teachers. I must not pause to tell of the important psychological effects of this kind of reproduction. The delights and disgusts which we feel in contact with the flesh of our kind were unknown. On the other hand, individuals were profoundly moved by the ever-changing tribal perfume. It is impossible to describe the strange variant of romantic love which each individual periodically felt for the tribe. The thwarting, the repression, the perversion of this passion was the source at once of the loftiest and the most sordid achievements of the race. Communal parenthood gave to the tribe unity and strength quite unknown in more individualistic races. The primitive tribes were groups of a few hundred or a few thousand individuals, but in modern times their size greatly increased. Always, however, the sentiment of tribal loyalty, if it was to remain healthy, had to be based on the personal acquaintance of its members. Even in the largest tribes, everyone was at least the friend of a friend's friend to every other member. Telephone, radio, and television enabled tribes as large as our smaller cities to maintain a sufficient degree of personal intercourse among their members. But always there was some point beyond which further growth of the tribe was unwholesome. Even in the smallest and most intelligent tribes, there was a constant strain between the individual's natural passion for the tribe and his respect for individuality in himself and his fellows. But whereas in the small tribes and healthy, larger tribes, the tribal spirit was kept sweet and sane by the mutual respect and the self-respect of the individuals, in the largest and imperfectly sane tribes, the hypnotic influence of the tribe was all too apt to drown personality. The members might even lose all awareness of themselves and their fellows as persons, and become mere mindless organs of the tribe. Thus, the community would degenerate into an instinctive animal herd. Throughout history, the finer minds of the race had realized that the supreme temptation was the surrender of individuality to the tribe. Prophets had over and over again exhorted men to be true to themselves, but their preaching had been almost wholly vain. The greatest religions of this strange world were not religions of love, but religions of self. Whereas in our world men long for the utopia in which all men shall love one another, the echinoderms were apt to exalt the religious hunger for strength to be oneself, without capitulation to the tribe. Just as we compensate for our inveterate selfishness by religious veneration of the community, so this race compensated for inveterate Gregisms by religious veneration of the individual. In its purest and most developed form, of course, the religion of self is most identical with the religion of love at its best. To love is to will the self-fulfillment of the beloved, and to find, in the very activity of loving, an incidental but vitalizing increase of oneself. On the other hand, to be true to oneself, to the full potentiality of the self, involves the activity of love. It demands the discipline of the private self in service of a greater self which embodies the community and the fulfillment of the spirit of the race. But the religion of self was no more effective with the echinoderms than the religion of love with us. The precept, love thy neighbor as thyself, breeds in us most often the disposition to see one's neighbor merely as a poor imitation of oneself, and to hate him if he proves different. With them, the precept, be true to thyself, bred the disposition merely to be true to the tribal fashion of mentality. Modern industrial civilization caused many tribes to swell beyond the wholesome limit. It also introduced artificial super tribes or tribes of tribes, corresponding to our nations and social classes. Since the economic unit was the internally communistic tribe, not the individual, the employing class was a small group of small and prosperous tribes. And the working class was a large group of large and impoverished tribes. The ideologies of the super tribes exercised absolute power over all individual minds under their sway. In civilized regions, the super tribes and the overgrown natural tribes created an astounding mental tyranny. In relation to his natural tribe, at least if it was small and genuinely civilized, the individual might still behave with intelligence and imagination. Along with his actual tribal kinsmen, he might support a degree of true community unknown to Earth. He might, in fact, be a critical, self-respecting, and other respecting person, but in all matters connected with the super tribes, whether national or economic, he behaved in a very different manner. All ideas coming to him with the sanction of nation or class would be accepted uncritically and with fervor by himself and all his fellows. As soon as he encountered one of the symbols or slogans of his super tribe, he ceased to be a human personality and became a sort of de-cerebrate animal, capable only of stereotyped reactions. In extreme cases, his mind was absolutely closed to influences opposed to the suggestion of the super tribe. Criticism was either met with blind rage or actually not heard at all. Persons who in the intimate community of their small native tribe were capable of great mutual insight and sympathy might suddenly, in response to tribal symbols, be transformed into vessels of crazy intolerance and hate directed against national or class enemies. In this mood, they would go to any extreme or self-sacrifice for the supposed glory of the super tribe. Also, they would show great ingenuity in contriving means to exercise their lustful vindictiveness upon enemies who, in favorable circumstances, could be quite as kindly and intelligent as themselves. At the time of our visit to this world, it seemed that mob passions would destroy civilization completely and irrevocably. The affairs of the world were increasingly conducted under the sway of the spreading mania of super-tribalism, conducted, in fact, not intelligently, but according to the relative emotional compulsions of the most meaningless slogans. I must not stay to describe how, after a period of chaos, a new way of life at last began to spread over this distressed world. It could not do so till the super tribes had been disintegrated by the economic forces of mechanized industry and by their own frenzied conflict. Then, at last, the individual mind became once more free. The whole prospect of the race now changed. It was in this world that we first experienced that tantalizing loss of contact with the natives just at that point where, having established something like a social utopia throughout their planet, they were beset by the first painful stirrings of the spirit before advancement to some mental plane beyond our reach, or at least beyond such comprehension as we had. Of the other echinoderm worlds in our galaxy, one, more promising than the average, rose early to brilliance, but was destroyed by astronomical collision. Its whole solar system encountered a tract of dense nebula. The surface of every planet was fused. In several other worlds of this type, we saw the struggle of the more awakened mentality definitely fail. Vindictive and superstitious herd cults exterminated the best minds of the race and drugged the rest with customs and principles so damaging that the vital sources of sensitivity and adaptability on which all mental progress depends were destroyed forever. Many thousands of other quasi-human worlds, besides those of the echinoderm type, came to an untimely end. One, which succumbed to a curious disaster, perhaps deserves brief notice. Here we found a race of very human kind, with civilization had reached a stage and character much like our own, a stage in which the ideals of the masses are without the guidance of any well-established tradition, and in which natural science is enslaved to individualistic industry. Biologists discovered the technique of artificial insemination. Now, at this time, there happened to be a widespread cult of irrationalism, of instinct, of ruthlessness, and of the divine, primitive, brute men. This figure was particularly admired when he combined brutishness with the power of the mob controller. Several countries were subjected to tyrants of this type, and in the so-called democratic states, the same type was much favored by popular taste. In both kinds of country, men craved brute men as lovers and as fathers for their children. Since in the democratic countries women had attained a great economic independence, their demand for fertilization by brute men caused the whole matter to be commercialized. Males of the desirable type were taken up by syndicates and graded in 5 ranks of desirability. At a moderate charge, fixed in relation to the grade of the father, any woman could obtain brute man fertilization. So cheap was the 5th grade that only the most abject pauper was debarred from its services. The charge for actual copulation with even the lowest grade of selected male was, of course, much higher, since perforce the supply was limited. In the non-democratic countries, events took a different turn. In each of these regions, a tyrant of the fashionable type gathered upon his own person the adoration of the whole population. He was the God-sent hero. He was himself divine. Every woman longed passionately to have him, if not as a lover, at least as father of her children. In some lands, artificial insemination from the master was permitted only as a supreme distinction for women of perfect type. Ordinary women of every class, however, were entitled to insemination from the authorized aristocratic stud of brute men. In other countries, the master himself condescended to be the father of the whole future population. The result of this extraordinary custom of artificial fatherhood by brute men, which was carried on without remission in all countries for a generation, and in a less thorough manner for a very much longer period, was to alter the composition of the whole quasi-human race. In order to maintain continued adaptability to an ever-changing environment, a race must, at all costs, preserve itself its slight but potent salting of sensibility and originality. In this world, the precious factor now became so diluted as to be ineffective. Henceforth, the desperately complex problems of the world were consistently bungled. Civilizations decayed. The race entered on a phase of what might be called pseudo-civilized barbarism, which was in essence subhuman and incapable of change. This state of affairs continued for some millions of years, but at last the race was destroyed by the ravages of a small, rat-like animal, against which it could devise no protection. I must not stay to notice the strange fortunes of all the many other quasi-human worlds. I will mention only that in some, though civilization was destroyed in the succession of savage wars, the germ of recovery precariously survived. In one, The agonizing balance of the old and the new seemed to prolong itself indefinitely. In another, where science had advanced too far for the safety of an immature species, man accidentally blew up his planet and his race. In several, the dialectical process of history was broken short by invasion and conquest on the part of inhabitants of another planet. These and other disasters, to be described in due course, decimated the galactic population of worlds. In conclusion, I will mention that in one or two of these quasi-human worlds, a new and superior biological race emerged naturally during the typical world crisis, gained power by sheer intelligence and sympathy, took charge of the planet, persuaded the aborigine, oh my gosh, aborigines. Oh, I have never had to say this word out loud. Yeah, native inhabitant to the country, a member of original people, but I've never had to say this word out loud. That's fine. You know what I'm saying. Let's see, where were we? Oh yeah, deceased breeding peopled the whole planet with its own superior type and created a human race which attained communal mentality and rapidly advanced beyond the limits of our exploring and overstrained understanding. Before our contact failed, we were surprised to observe that, as the new species superseded the old and took over the vast political and economic activity of that world, it came to realize with laughter the futility of all this feverish and aimless living. Under our eyes, the old order began to give place to a new and simpler order, in which the world was to be peopled by a small, aristocratic population served by machines, freed alike from drudgery and luxury, and intent on exploration of the cosmos of the mind. This changeover to a simpler life happened in several other worlds, not by the intervention of a new species, but simply by the victory of the new mentality in its battle against the old. And that is the end of part 2 of chapter 5. Perfect timing because I need a little sip. Part 3 of chapter 5. Nautiloids. Oh, we didn't even talk about start part 3. We didn't talk about part 2. So this one, they are going to other planets that have quasi-human folk living there, and just the differences that they have based on, like their environment. So like the really heavy gravitational planet had a like evolved from these really short, squatty, six-legged people. Yes, the penguin and the slug men. I enjoyed that one too. Yes. And it's also interesting, sort of how we get insight into how those worlds have also ended. Um, I was totally gonna say something very specific and I forgot. Forgot. I don't know. But yeah, the penguin and the slug man, those were the best ones. Absolutely the best ones. And probably will forever be the best ones. Okay, now we will start part 3, chapter 5. It's called Nautiloids. Nautiloids. As our exploration advanced and we gathered more and more helpers from the many worlds that we entered, our our imaginative insights into alien natures increased. Yeah, totally. The one-legged, one-armed ones were definitely the creepiest. Well, and he was even like talking about like the ones that were like very much like humans, except that their mouths were on their stomachs, and that's gross. That's gross. So optimistic that every remotely human civilization, yes, mhm, all of the quasi ones, they're all gone. They're all gone. There's no hope. But yeah, there were some like really gross, or not gross, but like scary, offsetting, creepy, I guess is the best word to put it. Yeah. Descriptions of them. Eerie. Yes, that would be a good one too. Eerie. Never scary. Never be scary. Okay. Though our research was still restricted to races which were in the throes of the familiar spiritual crisis, we gradually acquired the power of making contact with beings whose minds were very far from human in texture. I must now give. Oh, oh no, my Kindle went to sleep. Please hold. Please hold. The screen just like went away. There we go. Okay. I must now try to give some idea of the main types of these non-human intelligent worlds. In some cases, the difference from humanity, though physically striking and even mentally very remarkable, was not nearly so far-reaching as the cases to be described in the next chapter. A little sneak peek for the next chapter, I guess. In general, the physical and mental form of conscious beings is an expression of the character of the planet on which they live. On certain very large and aqueous planets, for instance, we found that civilization had been achieved by marine organisms. On these huge globes, no land dwellers as large as a man could possibly thrive, for gravitation would have nailed them to the ground. But in the water, there was no such limitation to bulk. One peculiarity of these big worlds was that, owing to the crushing action of gravitation, there were seldom any great elevations and depressions in their surface. Thus, they were usually covered by a shallow ocean, broken here and there by archipelagos of small, low islands. I shall describe one example of this kind of world, the greatest planet of a mighty sun. Situated, if I remember rightly, near the congested heart of the galaxy, this star was born late in galactic history, and it gave birth to planets when already many of the older stars were encrusted with smoldering lava. Owing to the violence of solar radiation, its nearer planets had, or will have, stormy climates. On one of them, a mollusk-like creature living in the coastal shallows acquired a propensity to drift in its boat-like shell on the sea's surface, thus keeping in touch with its drifting vegetable food. As the ages pass, its shell became better adapted to navigation. Mere drifting was supplemented by means of a crude sail, a membrane extending from the creature's back. In time, this nautiloid type proliferated into a host of species. Some of these remained minute, but some found size advantageous and developed into living ships. One of these became the intelligent master of this great world. The hull was a rigid, streamlined vessel, shaped much like the 19th century clipper in her prime, and larger than our largest whale. At the rear, a tentacle or fin developed into a rudder, which was sometimes used also as a propeller, like a fish's tail. But though all these species could navigate under their own power to some extent, their normal means of long-distance locomotion was their great spread of sail. The simple membranes of the ancestral type had become a system of parchment-like sails and bony masts and spars under voluntary muscular control. Similarity to a ship was increased by the downward-looking eyes, one on each side of the prow. The main masthead also bore eyes for searching the horizon. An organ of magnetic sensitivity in the brain afforded a reliable means of orientation. At the fore end of the vessel were two long manipulatory tentacles, which during locomotion were folded snugly to the flanks. In use, they formed a very serviceable pair of arms. It may seem strange that a species of this kind should have developed human intelligence. In more than one world of this type, however, a number of accidents combined to produce this result. The change from a vegetarian to a carnivorous habit caused a great increase of animal cunning in pursuit of the much speedier submarine creatures. The sense of hearing was wonderfully developed, for the movements of fish at great distance could be detected by the underwater ears. A line of taste organs along either bilge responded to the ever-changing composition of the water and enabled the hunter to track his prey. Delicacy of hearing and of taste combined with omnivorous habits and with great diversity of behavior and strong sociality to favor the growth of intelligence. Speech, that essential medium of the developed mentality, had two distinct modes in this world. For short-range communication, rhythmic underwater emissions of gas from a vent in the rear of the organism were heard and analyzed by means of underwater ears. Long-distance communication was carried on by means of seismophore signals from a rapidly agitating tentacle at the masthead. The organizing of communal fishing expeditions, the invention of traps, the making of lines and nets, the practice of agriculture, both in the sea and along the shores, the building of stone harbors and workshops, the use of volcanic heat for smelting metals, and of wind for driving mills, the projection of canals into the low islands in search of minerals and fertile ground, the gradual exploration and mapping of a huge world, the harnessing of solar radiation for mechanical power. These and many other achievements were at once a product of intelligence and an opportunity for its advancement. It was a strange experience to enter the mind of an intelligent ship, to see the foam circling under one's own nose as the vessel plunged through the waves, to taste the bitter or delicious currents streaming past one's flanks, to feel the pressure of air on the sails as one beat up against the breeze, to hear beneath the waterline the rush and murmur of distant shoals of fishes, and indeed actually to hear the sea bottom's configuration by means of the echoes that it cast up to the underwater ears. It was strange and terrifying to be caught in a hurricane, to feel the masts straining and the sails threatening to split, while the hull was battered by the small but furious waves of that massive planet. It was strange, too, to watch other great living ships as they plowed their way, heeled over, adjusted to the set of their yellow or russet sails to the wind's variations, and very strange it was to realize that these were not man-made objects, but themselves conscious and purposeful. Sometimes we saw two of the living ships fighting, tearing at one another's sails with snake-like tentacles, stabbing at one another's soft decks with metal knives, or at a distance firing at one another with cannon. Bewildering and delightful it was to feel in the presence of a slim female clipper the longing for contact, and to carry out with her on the high seas the tacking and yawing, the piratical pursuit and overhauling, the delicate, fleeting caress of tentacles, which formed the love play of this race. Strange to come up alongside, close hauled, grapple her to one's flank, and board her with sexual invasion. It was charming, too, to see a mother ship attended by her children. I should mention, by the way, that at birth the young were launched from the mother's decks like little boats, one from the port side, one from the starboard. Hence, they were suckled at her flanks. In play, they swam about her like ducklings, or spread their immature sails. In rough weather and for long voyaging, they were taken aboard. At the time of our visit, natural sails were beginning to be aided by a power unit and propeller which were fixed to the stern. Great cities of concrete docks had spread along many of the coasts and were excavated out of the hinterlands. We were delighted by the broad waterways that served as streets in these cities. They were thronged with sail and mechanized traffic, the children appearing as tugs and smacks among the gigantic elders. It was in this world that we found in its most striking form a social disease, which is perhaps the commonest of all world diseases, namely, the splitting of the population into two mutually unintelligible castes through the influence of economic forces. So great was the difference between adults of the two castes that they seemed to us at first to be distinct species, and we supposed ourselves to be witnessing the victory of a new and superior biological mutation over its predecessor. But this was far from the truth. In appearance, the masters were very different from the workers, quite as different as queen ants and drones from the workers of their species. They were more elegantly and accurately streamlined. They had a greater expanse of sail and were faster in fair weather. In heavy seas, they were less seaworthy, owing to their finer lines. But on the other hand, they were the more skillful and venturesome navigators. Their manipulatory tentacles were less muscular, but capable of finer adjustments. Their perception was more delicate. While a small minority of them perhaps excelled the best of the workers in endurance and courage, most were much less hardy, both physically and mentally. They were subject to a number of disintegrative diseases which never affected the workers, chiefly diseases of the nervous system. On the other hand, if any of them contracted one of the infectious ailments which were endemic to the workers, but seldom fatal, you would almost certainly die. They were also very prone to mental disorders and particularly to neurotic self-importance. The whole organization and control of the world was theirs. The workers, on the other hand, though racked by disease and neurosis bred of their cramped environments, were on the whole psychologically more robust. They had, however, a crippling sense of inferiority. Though in handicrafts and all small-scale operations they were capable of intelligence and skill. They were liable, when faced with tasks of wider scope, to a strange paralysis of mind. The mentalities of the two castes were indeed strikingly different. The masters were more prone to individual initiative and to the vices of self-seeking. The workers were more addicted to collectivism and the vices of subservience to the herd's hypnotic influence. The masters were on the whole more prudent, far-seeing, independent, self-reliant. The workers were more impetuous, more ready to sacrifice themselves in a social cause, often more clearly aware of the right aims of social activities, and incomparably more generous to individuals in distress. At the time of our visit, certain recent discoveries were throwing the world into confusion. Hitherto it had been supposed that the natures of the two castes were fixed unalterably by divine law and by biological inheritance. But it was now certain that this was not the case, and that the physical and mental differences between the classes were due entirely to nurture. Since time immemorial, the castes had been recruited in a very curious manner. After weaning, all children born on the port side of the mother, no matter what the parental caste, were brought up to be members of the master caste. All those born on the starboard side were brought up to be workers. Since the master class had, of course, to be much smaller than the working class, the system gave an immense superfluity of potential masters. The difficulty was overcome as follows. The starboard children of workers and the postborn children of masters were brought up by their own respective parents, but the portborn, potentially aristocratic children of workers were mostly disposed of by infant sacrifice. A few only were exchanged with the starboard-born children of masters. With the advance of industrialism, the increasing need for large supplies of cheap labor, the spread of scientific ideas, and the weakening of religion, came the shocking discovery that port-born children of both classes, if brought up as workers, became physically and mentally indistinguishable from workers. Industrial magnates in need of plentiful cheap labor now developed moral indignation against infant sacrifice, urging that the excess of port-born infants should be mercifully brought up as workers. Presently, certain misguided scientists made the even more subversive discovery that starboard-born children brought up as masters developed the fine lines, the great sails, the delicate constitution, the aristocratic mentality of the master caste. An attempt was made by the masters to prevent this knowledge from spreading to the workers, but certain sentimentalists of their own caste broodied it aboard and preached a newfangled and inflammatory doctrine of social equality. During our visit, the world was in terrible confusion. In backward oceans, the old system remained unquestioned, but in all the more advanced regions of the planet, a desperate struggle was being waged. In one great archipelago, a social revolution had put the workers in power, and a devoted, though ruthless dictatorship was attempting so to plan the life of the community that the next generation should be homogeneous and of a new type, combining the most desirable characters of both workers and masters. Elsewhere, the masters had persuaded their workers that the new ideas were false and base, and certain to lead to universal poverty and misery. A clever appeal was made to the vague but increasing suspicion that materialistic science was misleading and superficial, and that mechanized civilization was crushing out the more spiritual potentialities of the race. skilled propaganda spread the ideal of a kind of corporate state with port and starboard flanks, correlated by a popular dictator who, it was said, would assume power by divine right and the will of the people. I must not stay to tell the desperate struggle which broke out between these two kinds of social organizations. In the worldwide campaigns, many a harbor, many an ocean current flowed red with slaughter. Under the pressure of a war to the death, all that was best, all that was most human and gentle on each side, was crushed by the military necessity. On the one side, the passion for a unified world, where every individual should live a free and full life in service of the world community, was overcome by the passion to punish spies, traitors, and heretics. On the other, vague and sadly misguided yearnings for a nobler, less materialistic life were clearly transformed by the reactionary leader into vindictiveness against the revolutionaries. Very rapidly, the material fabric of civilization fell to pieces, not till the race had reduced itself to an almost subhuman savagery, and all the crazy traditions of a diseased civilization had been purged away, along with true culture, could the spirit of these shipmen set out again on the great adventure of the spirit. Many thousands of years later, it broke through on to that higher plane of being, which I have still to suggest as best I may. End of chapter 5. Oh, that was a doozy. Okay. So, the shipmen, very interesting. It reminds me of this portion of a series by Robin Hobb that is like the live ship traders, and the ships in this world are able to talk, and they're able to like communicate and see and do all of those things, which is weird and cool. And they also bring up the argument of nature versus nurture, like which is better, what is the one that determines the success of these shipmen, which is super interesting. Do you like sentient ships in sci-fi? It's okay. It's okay. Um, I mean, if we're talking spaceship, I like when the like computer is able to like be more sentient or like take on like human like qualities rather than like the ship itself, if that makes sense. I don't know. How do you feel about it? Oh, and I totally remembered as you're thinking about how you feel about sentient ships. Just as long as it isn't hell. And yes, just as long as it isn't hell, we're good. Something else that I forgot to mention earlier, for when I was like, oh, there's something specific that I want to talk about, and I couldn't think of anything. Um, it was the group, the planet that only wanted to breed with like one specific like donor or one specific like person or type of person, and how they died out because they didn't evolve. And I just think that that's like a really cool way of stating like, yes, people are different and that's a good thing. We don't want like super homogenous, which comes back to the end of this last part because it says that they wanted homogeny. And it's just interesting. Everything is interesting. You might have some distinctions like that in your head too. Okay. You don't really like censorship, but you're okay with AI things. And I think that's what it is. Yeah. Like if it's the ship itself or the car itself or like whatever it is itself, I don't think I jive with that quite as well. But yeah, if it's like the AI system within that, I like that much better. I like that much better. Okay, this chapter is not an hour long, so I'm flipping to see if we can do 2 chapters. No, no, we cannot. Chapter 6, Imitations of the Star Maker. It must not be supposed that the normal fate of intelligent races in the galaxy is to triumph. So far I have spoken mainly of those fortunate echinoderm and nautiloid worlds which did at last pass triumphantly into the more awakened state, and I have scarcely even mentioned the hundreds, the thousands of worlds which met disaster. This selection was inevitable because my space is limited, and because these 2 worlds, together with the even stranger spheres that I shall describe in the next chapter, were to have great influence on the fortunes of the whole galaxy. But many other worlds of human rank were quite as rich in history as those which I have noticed. Individual lives in them were no less varied than lives elsewhere, and no less crowded with distress and joy. Some triumphed, some in their last phase suffered a downfall, swift or slow, which lent them to the splendor of tragedy. But since these worlds play no special part in the main story of the galaxy, they must be passed over in silence, along with the still greater host of worlds which never attained even to human rank. If I were to dwell upon their fortunes, I should commit the same error as a historian who should try to describe every private life and neglect the pattern of the whole community. There's a lot of like, as we're talking about like the evolution of these different species and how they're like adapting to their world, and even how they're like their mating rituals and like how they raise their young and social aspects, like it's very anthropology, very much so, of like all of these science fiction-y worlds. Super interesting. If I were to dwell upon their fortunes, I should commit the same error as a historian who would try to describe every private life and neglect the pattern of the whole community. We already read that sentence. I have already said that. Oh my gosh. That is literally the next sentence, which is hilarious since I repeated that last sentence. I have already said that, as our experience of the destruction of worlds increased, we were increasingly dismayed by the wastefulness and seeming aimlessness of the universe. So many worlds, after so much distress, attained so nearly to social peace and joy, only to have the cup snatched from them forever. Often disaster was brought by some trivial flaw of temperament or biological nature. Some races had not the intelligence, some lacked the social will to cope with the problems of a unified world community. Some were destroyed by an upstart bacterium before their medical science was mature. Others succumbed to climatic change, many to loss of atmosphere. Sometimes the end came through collision with dense clouds of dust or gas, or with swarms of giant meteors. Not a few worlds were destroyed by the downfall of a satellite, the lesser body, blowing its way, age after age, through the extremely rarefied but omnipresent cloud of free atoms to interstellar space, would lose momentum. Its orbit would contract, at first slowly, then rapidly. It would set up prodigious tides in the oceans of the larger body and drown much of its civilization. Later, through the increasing stress of the planet's attraction, the great moon would begin to disintegrate. First, it would cast its ocean in a deluge on men's heads, then its mountains, and then the titanic and fiery fragments of its core. If in none of these manners came the end of the world, then inevitably, though perhaps not till the later days of the galaxy, it must come in another way. The planet's own orbit, fatally contracting, must bring every world at last so close to its sun that conditions must pass beyond the limit of life's adaptability, and age by age all living things must be parched to death and roasted. Dismay, terror, horror many a time seized us as we witnessed these huge disasters. An agony of pity for the last survivors of these worlds was part of our schooling. The most developed of the slaughtered worlds did not need our pity, since their inhabitants seemed capable of meeting the end of all that they cherished with peace, even a strange, unshakable joy, which we in this early stage of our adventure could by no means comprehend. But only a few, very few, could reach this state, and only a few out of the great host of worlds could win through even to the social peace and fullness toward which all were groping. In the more lowly worlds, moreover, few were the individuals who won any satisfaction of life even within the narrow bounds of their own imperfect nature. No doubt one or two, here and there, in almost every world, found not merely happiness, but the joy that passes all understanding. But to us, crushed now by the suffering and futility of 1,000 races, it seemed that this joy itself, this ecstasy, whether it was supported by scattered individuals or by whole worlds, must, after all, be condemned as false, and that those who had found it must, after all, have been drugged by their own private and untypical well-being of spirit, for surely it had made them insensitive to the horror around them. The sustaining motive of our pilgrimage had been the hunger which formerly drove men on earth in search of God. Yes, we had one and all left our native planets in order to discover whether, regarding the cosmos as a whole, a spirit which we all in our hearts obscurely knew and haltingly prized, the spirit which on earth we sometimes call humane, was Lord of the universe, or outlaw, almighty, or crucified. And now it was becoming clear to us that if the cosmos had any lord at all, he was not that spirit, but some other, whose purpose in creating the endless fountain of worlds was not fatherly toward the beings that he had made, but alien, inhuman, dark. Yet while we felt dismay, we felt also increasingly the hunger to see and to face fearlessly whatever spirit was indeed the spirit of this cosmos. For as we pursued our pilgrimage, passing again and again from tragedy to farce, from farce to glory, from glory often to a final tragedy, we felt increasingly the sense that some terrible, some holy, yet at the same time unimaginably outrageous and lethal secret lay just beyond our reach. Again and again, we were torn between horror and fascination, between moral rage against the universe, or the Star Maker, and unreasonable worship. This same conflict was to be observed in all those worlds that were of our own mental stature. Observing these worlds and the phases of their past growth and groping as best we might toward the next plane of spiritual development, we came at last to see plainly the first stages of any world's pilgrimage. Even in the most primitive ages of every normal, intelligent world, there existed in some minds the impulse to seek and praise some universal thing. At first, this impulse was confused with the craving for protection by some mighty power. Inevitably, the beings theorized that the admired thing must be power, and that worship was mere propitiation. Thus, they came to conceive the almighty tyrant of the universe, with themselves as his favored children. But in time it became clear to their prophets that mere power was not what the praiseful heart adored. And I should note, every time power is mentioned, it's with a capital. Then theory enthroned wisdom or law or righteousness. And after an age of obedience to some phantom lawgiver or to divine legality itself, the beings found that these concepts too were inadequate to describe the indescribable glory that the heart confronted in all things, and mutely prized in all things. But now, in every world that we visited, alternative ways opened out before the worshippers. Some hoped to come face to face with their shrouded God solely by inward searching meditation, by purging themselves of all lesser, all trivial desires, by striving to see everything dispassionately and with universal sympathy. They hoped to identify themselves with the spirit of the cosmos. Often they traveled far along the way of self-perfecting and awakening, but because of this inward absorption, most of them became insensitive to the suffering of their less awakened fellows and careless of the communal enterprise of their kind. In not a few worlds, this way of the spirit was thronged by all the most vital minds, and because the best attention of the race was given wholly to the inner life, material and social advancement was checked. The sciences of physical nature and of life never developed. Mechanical power remained unknown, and medical and biological power also. Consequently, these worlds stagnated, and sooner or later succumbed to accidents which might well have been prevented. There was a second way of devotion, open to creatures of a more practical temperament. These, in all the worlds, gave delighted attention to the universe around them, and chiefly they found worshipped thing in the persons of their fellow beings, and in the communal bonds of mutual insight and love between persons. In themselves and in each other they prized, above all things, love. And their prophets told them that the thing which they had always adored, the universal spirit, the Creator, the Almighty, the All-Wise, was also the All-Loving. Let them therefore worship in practical love of one another and in service of the love God. And so for an age, short or long, they strove feebly to love and to become members one of another. They spun theories in defense of the theory of the love God. They set up priesthoods and temples in service of love, and because they hungered for immortality, they were told that to love was the way to attain eternal life. And so love, which seeks no reward, was misconceived. In most worlds, these practical minds dominated over the meditators. Sooner or later, practical curiosity and economic need produced the material sciences. Probing every region with these sciences, the beings found nowhere, neither in the atom nor in the galaxy, nor, for that matter, in the heart of man either, any signature of the love God. And what with the fever of mechanization and the exploitation of slaves by masters, and the passions of intertribal warfare, and the increasing neglect or coarsening of all the more awakened activities of the spirit, the little flame of praise in their hearts sank lower than it had ever been in any earlier age, so low that they could no longer recognize it, and the flame of love, long fanned by the forced drought of doctrine, but now suffocated by the general obtuseness of the beings of one another, was reduced to an occasional smouldering warmth, which was most often mistaken for mere lust. With bitter laughter and rage, the tortured beings now dethroned the image of the love God in their hearts. And so without love and without worship, the unhappy beings faced the increasingly formidable problems of their mechanized and hate-racked world. This was the crisis which we in our own worlds knew so well. Many a world up and down the galaxy never surmounted it, but in a few, some miracle, which we could not yet clearly envisage, raised the average minds of these worlds to a higher plane of mentality. Of this I shall speak later. That happens a lot, where we say just a little snippet of something and it's but we'll talk about that later. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Meanwhile, I will say only that in the few worlds where this happened, we noticed invariably, before the minds of that world passed beyond our reach, a new feeling about the universe, a feeling which it was very difficult for us to share. Not till we had learned to conjure in ourselves something of this feeling could we follow the fortunes of these worlds. But as we advanced on our pilgrimage, our own desires began to change. We came to wonder whether, in demanding lordship of the university for the divinely humane spirit that we prized most in ourselves and in our fellow mortals in all the worlds, we were perhaps impious. We came less and less to require that love should be enthroned behind the stars. More and more we desired merely to pass on, opening our hearts to accept fearlessly whatever of the truth might fall within our comprehension. There was a moment, late in this early phase of our pilgrimage, when, thinking and feeling in unison, we said to one another, "If the Star Maker is love, we know that this must be right. But if it is not, if he is some inhuman spirit, this must be right. And if he is nothing, if the stars and all else are not his creatures, but self-subsistent, and if the adored spirit is but an exquisite creature of our minds, then this must be right. This and no other possibility. For we cannot know whether the highest place for love is on the throne or on the cross. We cannot know what spirit rules, for on the throne sits darkness. We know, we have seen, that in the waste of stars, love is indeed crucified, and rightly, for its own proving, and for the throne's glory. Love and all that is humane we cherish in our hearts, yet also we salute the throne and the darkness upon the throne. Whether it be love or not love, our hearts praise it, outsoaring reason. But before our hearts could be properly attuned to this new, strange feeling, we had still far to go in the understanding of worlds of human rank, though diverse. I must now try to give some idea of several kinds of worlds very different from our own, but not in essentials more mature. And that is the end of chapter 6. So something that's interesting that I do appreciate, in each of these worlds, there is a thorough line of some of the commentary that has been mentioned. So religion, homogeneity, racism, that's pretty thorough in the worlds that they're visiting. But the demise or the major crux, like the major issue, the major standstill for each world is different, and also a crux, a standstill, all of these things for Earth. So in the commentary of these not dis or not utopian worlds, we're saying, I don't know where I was going with that, with the end of that with the end of that sentence, but it is interesting to have that sort of like outsider view and be like, oh well, this is what's wrong with the society, like this is what's wrong with your planet, and if you just did this, then it would be totally different. Or you know what I mean? Instead of like being involved in it, you have that like, I'm gonna say it again, but the outsider view, the outsider's perspective, being able to see it with new eyes, which is kind of cool. But yeah, that's gonna be where we end today. The next chapter is far too long, but we have all the downfalls here. Yeah, all those other worlds just have one downfall, and and we have all of them. Aren't we lucky? Aren't we so, so lucky? uh, yeah, but yay. So yes, that is gonna be all for tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. We will be picking up right at chapter 7, right, which is right where we left off next time. Very soon. Very soon indeed. So I hope you all have a great night. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Thank you so much for letting me just do what I do. Thank you. Bye.